That'll be fun. Tonight we have at the River Falls Public Library Emily Jacobson and Amber Moore from Healing Roots Wellness Center. Both Emily and Amber are licensed acupuncturists. Tonight they're going to be discussing the basics of traditional Chinese medicine and community acupuncture. Those of you who are joining at home, if there are any appointments for the community acupuncture session left after the event tonight, we'll post that tomorrow on our Facebook page and website. Enjoy. Emily?
Hi, I'm Emily Jacobson. I own Healing Roots Wellness Center here in River Falls. I've been an acupuncturist for about 8 years now. And before that, I was a massage therapist for 17 years. So I've been in the body working world for a very long time. So tonight, we'll be talking about really the basics of traditional Chinese medicine, which in the PowerPoint, it will be called TCM, which is the abbreviation for traditional Chinese medicine. So I want to start with two case studies before we go into the big basics. So I worked with a 37-year-old female. She was in early menopause. She had not menstruated for 3 or 4 months. And the tests from Western medicine doctors said, you have no hormones, no chance of ever having a baby again. And this was her goal, is she wanted another baby. And so she knew in her heart there was another way, that this was not the final answer. And so after 4 months of doing acupuncture, having her on herbs and doing moxibustion, she started menstruating again. And it did take another year, but then she had another baby. And it was very exciting. In another case study, I was working with a 50-year-old female who had chronic loose stools, so much so she was terrified to lay on the table for an hour. And she had no energy. This had been going on for about a month and a half, and no appetite. Really, she was in some dire straits. It was a very uncomfortable situation for her. And what I did with her is I did acupuncture and I did moxa on a slice of ginger on her belly button, and immediately it changed. And she had no more issues in her digestive system. So it works. So I'll go into the history a little bit of Chinese medicine. So there is evidence that this was starting to be understood about 4,000 years ago. And it was a process to really develop the entire model and system of Chinese medicine, especially back then. There weren't a whole lot of people like there are now, and the communication processes were slow to get from one person to the next. So in about 2,000 years, it really did get fully developed. And so 2,000 years ago, there was the very first textbook called the Huangdi Neijing, or the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine. And we still study that. That is one of our textbooks that we study. However, there are many other textbooks that have been produced since then. So the philosophy of Chinese medicine it's developed by observing nature. And that's pretty much what they had in those days, was nature. And they made some deep observations of very simple philosophies, or very simple kind of how things work in the world. An example would be that fire stirs wind. So if you have a fire under a tree, it makes the leaves blow. It stirs up wind, right? And dampness obstructs flow. So if you imagine a dry cloth versus a wet cloth, and you try to blow water or blow air through a dry cloth, you can blow air through that. But if you try to blow air through a wet cloth, that dampness obstructs that flow. So these are some of the phenomenons that were observed in nature that they then understood actually applied to our bodies too, because we are not separate from nature. Our egos try to tell us that we are, but we are not separate from nature. And these are micro and macro phenomenons that mirror each other. So these, as I just said, these phenomenons, they happen inside our bodies, and what they understood of that was uh, they could only understand that because they didn't have a microscope. So that was how they could see how our bodies functioned, right? They couldn't look inside and see the cellular functions. We do that now, but they just saw all of these phenomenons and understood that happened in our bodies too. So like heat rises, right? So when we get warm, our faces get flushed. That's heat rising up. Um, and so traditional Chinese medicine, the terminology that I'll go into is a combination of these two things. The organ systems, that they could see that. They did dissections, but they couldn't see our cells, so they could see our organs. So combining the organ systems with these phenomenons in nature is what Chinese medicine language is. So an example of that. So liver fire stirring wind. It sounds pretty funny, but not to an acupuncturist. So that's really high blood pressure causing dizziness and tinnitus. So when you hear wind, it's kind of a whistle in your ear, and that's what is the wind in the deep inside the ears. Spleen qi deficiency causing dampness and obstructing the limbs would be edema. And also water flows downwards. It's heavy, and so a lot of the time we get edema in the limbs more than anywhere else in our bodies. And then liver heat rising, causing a headache. So as I explained, and we all kind of understand that the heat rises, right? So that's going to cause pressure going up and cause headaches. So the philosophy of yin and yang, this is really one of the basic foundations of Chinese medicine. Um, and you've all heard of yin and yang, but I'm sure you've heard it as yang. When you study under Chinese professors for 4 years, you learn to say yang. It's the nature of opposites. I'm sure most of you know kind of the real basics of this. You've seen the symbol before, the black and white, which are opposites. Sun and moon are opposites. Water and fire, male and female. And then there's blood and qi, and form and function, sedentary and movement. Um, and they are mutually necessary. They cannot exist. Life cannot exist without them balancing each other out. So in the body, we have to have both yin and yang. And when they're out of balance, our body's out of balance. And one of the best examples that I can give of this is that yin is our cooling system in the body. That is the water. And yang is the heating system. That is fire. So we all know heat rises and cold sinks. So they hold each other up. So they hold each other in place. So the yang, holds the yin from sinking, and the yin holds the yang from flaring. So when women go through menopause and have hot flashes, we in Chinese medicine say they are yin deficient. So if yin and yang need to be balanced to keep them in place, and somebody is yin deficient, then yang can then flare up and people get hot flashes. And when death happens, that is when yin and yang have separated. So when we are working with a person and the person's issues, our treatment philosophy runs along. We start with, is this internal or is this external? So internal would be, are the organ systems off and the qi of the organs off, or is there a pathogen from outside coming in? And we see pathogens, external pathogens and internal pathogens. Cold is a pathogen. Heat is a pathogen. And we can all kind of understand that. Like, we don't feel good when we are too hot. And when we're sick, we get hot. We have a fever and we get hot. So first we start there. Is it internal or external? Is it excess or deficiency? Is somebody deficient in something, or do they have too much of something? And then we go into the organ system. We look and we see, is this coming from the heart or the lungs or the liver or the spleen? And when I talk about organs like this, we don't actually talk about the Western medicine organ function. What we talk about is the chi function of the organ. They do overlap, but so if I tell somebody they're not sleeping because they have heart fire, I make sure that they understand I'm not saying there's something wrong with their heart organ. It's the chi of the organ, and it's a very different thing. So we go into the organ systems, find which organ system is out of balance, and then find the pattern of that organ that is out of balance, and then we pick the points and we put needles in, and usually people get better. So I like to say that Chinese medicine is Winnie the Pooh logic. It's simple and basic, but totally outside the box. And the story I like to share about this concept is that Winnie the Pooh and his friends were lost in the woods, and they were lost by a sand pit. This is in one of the books. They were lost by a sand pit, and they kept looking for home. And as they kept looking for home, they kept finding the sand pit. And so finally, Winnie the Pooh said, maybe if we start looking for the sand pit instead of looking for home, we'll find home. And they did. Very simple and totally outside the box, but it worked. So I gave you some of the foundations of and I know that we spend 4 years learning this medicine. So this is such a quick overview. If it doesn't make sense or if you have questions, please feel free to ask at any time. But yes. So I'll get into that. So the question is chi the vibe or something more abstract than just the vibe? I will get into that. Yes, and yes. So acupuncture points and meridians and chi. That's the next part of the slideshow. So really, this is the invisible beauty within us. So points and meridians. So TCM treats disease by addressing the dysfunction of qi flow. And we do that by putting these conducting tools, acupuncture needles are little metal wires. Then we put these conducting tools into specific points that have specific functions. So qi flows along the channels or pathways, which we call meridians. There are 12 of these channels within our bodies. They're each related to organs. There's 6 on the arms and 6 on the legs. The belief is that these were discovered and understood by just simply sensing it. And my understanding of this is people 2,000 years ago were not as distracted by life as we are now. They had a better sense of those subtleties that are inside the body. And they are subtle. These are very subtle things that we often are very desensitized by. So there's the meridians, and then there's the acupuncture points are found along these meridians. There are 365 points on the meridian systems, which is equal to the amount of days in the year. Each point has a specific function, and so I love to give this example. There is a point on the lower leg. You here personally can see this as I'm pointing to my lower leg here. There's a point on the lower shin or the upper shin. It's called stomach 36. There is no nerve connection from the brain or the stomach to that point, but they've done MRIs while needling that point, and the stomach part of the brain is activated. So it's definitely connected. And so when we put a needle into that point, it's activating the stomach function. And that can be either decreasing the excess or increasing the deficiency. The body knows usually what it needs. And we also have techniques of how we manipulate the needles to increase or decrease. So there's also microsystems, which represent the entire body. There's a microsystem in the ear, there's a microsystem on the scalp, on the hands, and on the feet. Usually the scalp and the ears are the more commonly used microsystems, but they represent the entire body. I use them personally as a support system as I needle the whole body, then I do the ears or the scalp just to kind of reinforce what I've done through the body. So there's a picture there of the meridian system on a doll. Actually, people would even practice on dolls, and just some needling there. So, what is qi? It's a really big question, and really, essentially, everything is qi, but also everything has form. So typically we think of qi, you kind of said the vibe, right? So people often say it's energy or life force. Those are common ways to say it. When I first started school, I very much remember this first day when our professor was talking about what is qi. And he said the best translation is really no shape, no form. And that's confusing when everything is chi, but chi is no shape, no form. And we look out into the world and there is shape and form everywhere. Um, so what I love what he said next was that form is actually the manifestation of chi movement, which is vibration. So another reiteration of everything is vibration. Um, so she organizes things and creates patterns. And have you ever seen those really cool videos of sand on a speaker and it's pumping to a rhythm and the sand all of a sudden starts making these cool patterns? That's essentially what's happening. So chi is vibrating in certain ways, creating shapes and forms in our body. So like so our kidney chi has a certain vibration and a certain pattern that the chi is pulsing at. And here's a cool little thing about this. So each organ relates to an orifice in our body. So if you were to just randomly quick think about the orifices in our body, is there one that seems similarly shaped? I'm giving you a hint as I turn my head. Is there an organ or an orifice that's similarly shaped to the kidneys, our ears, that has the same like bean shape? And so what that is saying is that that's of the same vibration and it has made the same shape. And so we relate things like when deafness is occurring at an early age, then usually it's because of kidney chi deficiency. Um, so that's how chi is creating patterns through that rhythm and vibration and pulsing. It is silently going on in the background. As I said earlier, these are subtle things, but they're really powerful. It's organizing the cells of each organ in a particular way so they all function differently. So the kidneys function very differently than the liver. So they have a different vibration, a different frequency that they're pulsing at. And they organize the pace and patterns of our growth. So when we're young, we grow a lot faster. And as we age, we still grow. Our ears and our nose, they still grow. They're cartilage and they don't stop growing. If you didn't know that, that is a fun fact. I love this part too. And this is bringing this ancient concept into modernization, that it can be translated to the laws of quantum physics and string theory. So, did that answer your question about is chi a vibe? Okay. So what can Chinese medicine help with? It's a whole system medicine. So in other words, mostly everything. It really as I talked about the different organ systems, the different malfunctions that happen in the organ systems, we treat it all. The World Health Organization has a solid recognition of these certain things, though: pain management, sleep disturbances, anxiety and depression, digestive disorders, addiction, skin disorders, immune support, and menopause and PMS and women's health. So beyond acupuncture, Chinese medicine is much more than acupuncture. And actually, in China, they say that they use 80% herbs and 20% acupuncture. So that's really more Chinese medicine than acupuncture itself. In the United States, people aren't as hip to herbs. We've got the Food and Drug Administration that doesn't regulate that. So then people have more of an aversion. They don't taste good. So we have more of an aversion. But anyway, so beyond acupuncture, we do herbs. And Amber and I were both trained at the same school. We were both trained in herbology. Also, there's cupping. Most of you have heard of cupping or seen the marks of cupping. Michael Phelps kind of made it famous one year during the Olympics. And then there's moxa or moxibustion. That's that lower picture. It's an herb that is burned. Mugwort, Amber, did you say? I said something about it being in the sage family, and you're like, it's not quite in the sage family. Okay, so it's artemisia. That is rolled up into a stick and then burned over the body. And it's a wonderful medicine. And it smells like sage. It has a very similar smell to sage. Um, Well, a little bit of both. So the question is, you burn it, you don't just set it on you. Mostly, you burn it above the body, and there's different techniques of actually putting it on the body, but taking it off before it burns the body. There is a technique of that stomach 36 point that I showed earlier of actually putting scarring that point on purpose so that it's constantly stimulated because of the pull of the scar. That's not. I mean, I've never done that, but I was trained that that's a thing. So dietary therapy, there's Tuina, which is Chinese medicine massage, which is working with the acupuncture points and the meridians while you get a massage. Gua sha, which is that middle picture, which is a scraping technique that is a really effective tool. Tai Chi is actually Chinese medicine. Qigong healing, Qigong movement are both part of the Chinese medicine models. So, what does a treatment look like? That is one of our treatment rooms at Healing Roots Wellness Center. So each session is about an hour. Once you're doing follow-up sessions, the initial consult's a lot longer as we sit together and talk and learn about your body. Once we've gotten to the point of follow-ups, then each session is about an hour. We do check in and connect. How you doing? What has changed? You lay on the table and receive needles. For me, it takes about 20 minutes to put the needles in, depending on the person and how many needles they receive. Some people can only handle about 5, and some people get about 50. It's totally different per person. And then you rest for 20 minutes. So I will leave the room. There's nice music on. There's a heat lamp on your body. Usually in the wintertime, I've got heat underneath the table. So you're laying on top of heat, and you rest for 20 minutes. I would say 95% of people fall asleep. It's really, really restful. And really, essentially, that's where our body does healing, is while we're resting. So we have to go into that rest state to do our healing. And then we do whatever additional modalities are needed. If you need some moxa, then we'll do moxa. You need some cupping, we'll do some cupping. You need some gua sha, we'll do some gua sha. Remove the needles. If you get some gua sha or tuina, we remove the needles first. um, and then you feel amazing. Actually, there's a term called acu-drunk that people walk out of the treatment room, and most people say, I'm kind of dizzy, I'm kind of spacey, but they love it. It feels really great. So, any questions? The question is, how is it different than dry needling? I'll give you my version of this answer, but somebody else might have a different version or a different answer. So I don't feel like there is much of a difference in the sense of what we have is called ASHA points, ASHI, ASHA points. And that is where the pain is at, you put the needle. It's not necessarily along the meridian. It might be, but it's not necessarily along the meridian. Where you have the pain, you put the needle. So that's dry needling also. Where you have the pain, you put the needle. I believe the reason why there's the word dry with this is because it's dry of the theory. It's dry of the Chinese medicine theory. They don't use meridians, they don't use organ systems. They know how to put the needle where the pain is at. And it's very effective. It's very effective. So when people ask me, do you do dry needling? Heck yeah, all the time. But I also do, needling that's full of theory too. So, yes. The question is, do we do e-stem? Absolutely. When it's necessary, not on everybody. Do e-stim, electrostimulation. So it's taking if you've ever used the TENS unit before, it's the same kind of tool, except we have alligator clips that we actually connect to the needles, which are conducting tools. So there's a higher level conduction that actually goes into the body, where with a TENS unit, it's sticking to your skin. I mean, it's still going into the body, but yes, Amber. The question is, what's the difference between a chiropractor doing acupuncture and an acupuncturist doing acupuncture? I feel like it's the dry needling concept of like they just put the needle where the pain is at. They don't have that theory behind things. Although I've interacted with some chiropractors who've taken more than a weekend, but a lot often, when people learn dry needling, they're a physical therapist. They have medical training. They're a chiropractor. They have years of medical training. They just take a weekend to learn how to insert a needle. Yes.
Yin yang image one of the comparisons or the pairs was blood and chi.
Yeah. Sure. So the question is, in the yin yang theory, the comparison was blood and qi. So blood is a yin substance. It is substance. And it's wet, it's heavy, it's more dense. Chi is spacious, it's energy, it's light. And just to add to that, what we say in Chinese medicine is that blood is the mother of qi. So qi moves the blood, it makes the blood move. So we take pulse when we are, I didn't add that into what a treatment looks like. We actually, to find your actual diagnosis, we listen to you, we listen to all of the patterns and symptoms that you have, and then we take your pulse. On each side there's 3 pulse points, and then 3 depths for each pulse point. And we also look at the tongue. So when we're taking the pulse and feeling how your pulse is, how your blood is moving in your vessel, what we're really feeling is, how is the chi moving your blood? What is the quality of the blood that the chi is supporting? Yeah. Yeah. Ooh, the question is, what would I tell somebody that's skeptical of acupuncture? Depends on how much time I have. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So skeptical of the idea you bruise easily. So bruising does happen. Well, the thing I say about that is, if that's the worst side effect, whatever. There's so many other terrible side effects from other medications. Um, but somebody who's generally skeptical of Chinese medicine, I mean, proof is in the pudding, first of all. So, one, if this was a miracle medicine, it's not a miracle medicine. But if it was a miracle medicine, there wouldn't be any other medicines on the planet. And there are other medicines. However, this is the one that's still around. So it's not a philosophy that you just believe in, and those types of things can stick around without having any kind of proof, right? So, but medicine, it dissipates if it doesn't have effect. People don't keep using it. I mean, there have been lots of different types of medicine out in this world that have come up for a short period of time, and they disappear because they don't work. This is 4,000 years old. It's still here. It works. Yes.
That it's admittedly non-scientific, but it works. That blows my mind. And I know also that it goes back to shamanic roots. And I was wondering if you could say anything about shamanism and connection with Chinese medicine.
Okay, so the question is, can I say anything about the connection of shamanism and Chinese medicine? I cannot. But what I can say is something about science in Chinese medicine. And two things. There are lots and lots and lots of studies that have been done to start proving the theories, and proving that, or not the theories, but proving the evidence it does work, right? So, like infertility, they put a lot of energy into studying infertility, and they see that it does work. But this is what to kind of touch on what you said about it's non-scientific. You can't measure chi at this point. Science is young. Science is still evolving. And I believe there will be a way that we can actually measure chi.
But to the shamanism,
Okay.
only because in those many thousands of years ago, a lot of that was chi connected to like when these ideas were being formed thousands of years ago, which we weren't there for, it was Taoism, and there was a lot of philosophy involved, and the I Ching was created at that time too, and that is where the shamanism comes in. And in the 8 guas of the I Ching, the 8 readings, is when they started sort of connecting the Taoism, all the different elements, the 5 elements of nature, although they put 8 in at the time, including thunder and mountain and lake. That sort of like started merging together, and the application of the elements to the channels is through that, the shamanism and the bagua, and the names of the channels and the elements associated with those channels all comes from that kind of like conglomeration of philosophy. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah. One. Isn't it skeptical comment?
Yeah, it's a really interesting place that those things all came together in that way.
Mhm. But I personally, I love how it can be, because it speaks to people. You know what I mean? People. So we have a large population of people who need that kind of scientific proof, and I personally love studying things myself and just seeing like, oh, worked this way, didn't work that way. But there's I think eventually science will catch up and be able to start measuring these types of things. That's really what science is about, is the measurement of things. So, any other questions? Is it safe to do when pregnant? Absolutely. There are definitely some points to not do when pregnant. And there are points that you can do at the end of pregnancy to support the process of we technically cannot induce labor, but we sure can support the process, and amazing things happen. But those are the points you don't do while the rest of the pregnancy, on purpose. Yeah. Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you. And I'll hand the floor over to Amber.
Let's see if I can find mine. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Am I speaking appropriately? I'm also a licensed acupuncturist. I went to the same school as Emily a little bit later. So I've been practicing about 6 years now. And I actually licensed in Minnesota, which is it's just a little different. So in some ways, it forces me to I am still in school forever because I'm constantly taking CEUs. And that's part of how I got into community acupuncture and started learning kind of like different branches that I utilize in the acupuncture I do as well. But still, mostly what I do is exactly the same as what Emily does. So I'm going to talk today about community acupuncture because for me, I'm really passionate about it. I feel like it's a really important thing for people to understand because it makes healthcare that much more accessible to that many more people. And I'm just here to tell you about kind of where it came from and kind of why you might consider it in the future or for your friends. So what is it? Community acupuncture. There's sort of like some basic guidelines to what all community acupuncture is going to have. First of all, it's always going to be in a group setting. You're going to be in a room with other people also getting acupuncture. And oh, I need to push the button, sorry. And this is actually how acupuncture is most often practiced in China, and it's partly because so many people get acupuncture regularly, it's just not possible for everybody to get an hour in a room, and it also makes it so that people can get the treatments they need, like, in their super busy lives. Um, it always will be utilizing mostly what we call distal points, which are points that are, like, farther away from your trunk, essentially. Mostly, we use points on your lower arms, lower legs, and some on your head. Um, and obviously, there's points all over the whole body, and we just don't make you take off your clothes because you're in a room with other people. So it's just about what's accessible. And there's, like Emily mentioned, there's like microsystems in the ear and on the scalp, but there's also microsystems over the whole body. And there's kind of a fascinating way you can use channel theory to balance parts of your body and other parts of your body. So that kind of relates to microsystems too. So we'd use distal points. Generally, in this country, community acupuncture is gonna involve sliding scale payment and not with insurance, and, um, that is really just about the commitment to accessibility, trying to make it casual and easy for people to pay what's comfortable for them on a regular basis. And that goes into casual environment. It's generally very intentionally made casual. It's pretty common for a lot of clinics to have just recliners or couches and low lighting and maybe lots of art on the walls and some rugs and some nice music. Like that's not because of a lack of professionalism. That's a choice that people make so that your body can get into that comfortable state that Emily mentioned that we need to heal in. We need to feel comfortable. And a lot of people don't feel comfortable in a super sterile doctor's environment. That's part of why a lot of people don't go to doctors. They're scared. Their bodies are scared on a very deep level. Um, it's also a business model. So, kind of the idea is that if you can treat enough people in one room at the same time, you can sustain a business and you can keep yourself open as a as an acupuncturist practicing and trying to, you know, keep going in this world. I don't think anybody gets crazy rich off of this model, but it is sustainable. Um, and then the last thing to know about community acupuncture when people mention it, it is a social justice movement. It has been very important as a social justice movement in this country, which I'll talk a little bit about and give some examples of some really inspiring people. Um, but yeah, it's trying to address the inequity in our country's medical history. Mhm. Here's some pictures of what it looks like. Like, it's helpful to know what you're getting into. And these are just some different clinics. I just took some pictures from places online. A lot of them will have these zero gravity chairs, like lawn chairs that you can lay back in. Some of them are pretty cramped. Some of them just pop up like I do in Emily's studio. I just bring my chairs out and we just pop up in the space. Why would anybody choose to do community acupuncture instead of individual acupuncture? And I would say that both are great, by the way. There's not a one better than the other thing here. But why you might choose community acupuncture, one is treatment protocol is really important when you're getting acupuncture. Even though sometimes there's a miraculous treatment where one treatment makes you better and that thing that was bothering you never comes back again. And that is really awesome when that happens. I've seen it a couple times, but more often people have chronic issues that they've spent their lifetime developing and they need to get regular acupuncture for a while to kind of bump the health curve like this. You get a little better, your body starts remembering all those things it learned its whole life. And then you come back and it gets a little better and it gets a little worse again. Eventually, you'll get up to here, though, if you do a regular treatment protocol. And that's hard sometimes for people if it ends up being a little outside of their budget to go to an individual acupuncturist every week. So that's the other thing. It's affordable. It's more affordable for people. It reaches just a little bit broader demographic. It's not necessarily solving all the world health problems, but it does reach more people, and that is important right now. Um, it also is an environment where you get to engage with your community about your health and you get to have conversations. It's part of that casual environment. I learn things all the time from my patients and we bounce ideas off of each other and we trade things and you really do form community around health. It's a beautiful thing. Um, it can be important for some people, especially if they have any trauma or abuse in their background, to have a safe setting. And a group is a really safe setting because people are on their best behavior around other people. It's kind of an amazing phenomenon, and it's really great to lean into. And it happens on a physical level. These are things that I'm, like, verbalizing, but a lot of times it's just about what happens when a person comes in a room or what happens when a person gets alone in a room with a doctor in a white coat, and you just need, once again, keep addressing that body and feeling safe. Some people really like how when you heal together, similar to doing meditation together or doing yoga together or chanting together, it generates healing chi ultimately. And whether or not you believe in that, some people really, really value that when it comes to their own healing because you get to, amplify whatever's happening in your body. Um, what else? Casual environments, once again. If you're comfortable in a casual place, your parasympathetic nervous system is what's going to be activated, and that needs to be activated in order to start your healing process. So, what is the social justice part, you might be wondering, of community acupuncture? This is kind of my favorite part. I'm going to do a very brief summary of how Chinese medicine has worked in this country. Um, there's two aspects. There's this strong drive to professionalize and legitimize the healthcare field that has affected a lot of people in this country, not just acupuncturists and Chinese medicine practitioners. It's affected herbalists and chiropractors and all the different kinds of medicine that are out there and we're starting to become aware of again. And then we also, I'm sorry if you guys already know this, but it's helpful to know, about Chinese immigration history a little bit because that has affected how Chinese medicine has been practiced in this country for a long time. So, when in US history we started to try and professionalize the medical field, or when some people started to professionalize the medical field, these terms started to be used of regular medicine and irregular medicine. And regular medicine was really just mostly one kind of medicine, and it really involved the doctor having absolute power over a patient and not valuing the patient's own perspective of their health. It had a lot to do with the heroic methods of medicine, which sometimes are amazing, like surgery. This is like some sort of early blood transfusion happening. Um, and it generally required a person to have some sort of educational background in that kind of medicine specifically. Um, and then irregular medicine was everything else. And this is just one person. This was an ad from the turn of the century when women were practicing regularly in medicine and there were people of color and there were people from other countries because we have this amazing conglomeration of immigration in this country. But for whatever reason, that became irregular medicine. And this is sort of an outline of what was happening when. In 1847, the American Medical Association was being formed by just the regular medicine practitioner. Um, in 1901, California started to begin medical licensing law. And what that means is they could start shutting down practitioners if they didn't have the right accreditations. And that included like family doctors who'd been treating people their whole lives and everybody knew were helpful. They were not only shut down, but often arrested. In 1904, there were literally 5 professors who standardized the medical field, and they went through and they evaluated all the medical schools, societies, asylums, hospitals, and institutions in the country. And this ended up closing down a lot of schools and they definitely targeted ones for Black physicians, ones that admitted women, and ones with lower funding because they couldn't afford to keep up to the standard that were being imposed on them by these 5 people. And in 1910, this was sort of the death blow, was the Flexner Report, and this is taught in Western herbalism too. This report was really important, even though it was written by one very inexperienced undergraduate guy. It was just published really well, and it got a lot of clout, and it just badmouthed every form of medicine except regular medicine, and it really kind of ended people's general acceptance of anything but regular medicine at that time. And in Chinese immigration, this is another fun story. It's a really nice picture of a early apothecary. Um, it's not going. Oh, it is going forward. Sorry. So that was happening at the turn of the century. Also at the turn of the century, there's a massive Chinese immigration movement. Most of them ended up being miners, and then they later became railroad workers. Um, and then in 1862, there was the Anti-Coolie Act. It was a government-mandated tax put on people. If they hired Chinese workers, they had to pay extra taxes, and if they were Chinese, they had to pay extra taxes to work. Um, in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was put into effect. And that I just want to point out it wasn't repealed until 1943 and not really fully until like about 1952. But the Chinese Exclusion Act made it illegal to immigrate if you were Chinese. Essentially, the only way you could immigrate is if you were a merchant. So at that point, it was illegal to be a Chinese medicine practitioner or really much of anything but a merchant, which was trying to bring in only people of wealth for the most part. But it's also why when you see Chinese merchant places, especially pictures from the past, the grocers or places where business was done, they often are very obviously also apothecaries because Chinese medicine is a major part of Chinese culture, and everybody does a little bit of herbalism. So, having access to those herbs and that medicine, and hopefully somebody in that apothecary who can help you if something drastic is happening, was really important. It is just not publicly allowed and not ever acknowledged. um, so, the other reason why Chinese medicine was really important is because that entire immigrant population was not admitted into Western medicine facilities. And when they were generally quarantined and often blamed for any epidemics that happened. And that is part of why also there were these 3 major massacres, and there were also a lot of mobs that went through Chinatowns and burnt down people's homes and hurt people a lot. And that is just important to know as why it's so amazing that this Chinese medicine has survived in this country and has continued to help people. So here's some just artist renditions of what it might have been like to be Chinese in this country. Part of why they became railroad workers too is because the railroads tried really hard to hire white people, but nobody wanted to work for them. And the railroad didn't really want to pay the taxes to hire Chinese, but they did by just paying them extremely low wages. And then they also hired them to bust unions. So that's part of why the unions ended up being very racist, specifically against Chinese, because the railroads hired Chinese people to bust unions for the poor wages that the railroad was paying to the Irish people. It's kind of complicated, but that ends up being why there were these massacres amongst people that were very similar in some ways in these rural places. There's like a memorial at one of the massacre sites. There was a lot of I mean, this is not something that was secret. There was a lot of political debate about this. People were aware that it was not a fun thing to be Chinese. So now I'm gonna tell you about some inspiring people in community acupuncture history. This is Ing Hai, I don't know how to say his name. He was a Chinese immigrant and he came here and was a merchant who actually started out being a miner, and he eventually found somebody that he studied under, Doc Lee, um, and learned Chinese herbalism. He set up this clinic, Kam Wachung, in I believe it was in Oregon, and they specifically made it to be mob proof. They had like iron bars on the door, and they made it out of stone so that it couldn't be burnt down. And it, it's interesting. They were very careful the whole time they had that clinic open. They like only chopped wood inside, and they were careful just never to be vulnerable. And at the same time, they were treating that entire community of people, and um, that's what it was. A third of the clients were white women who often couldn't get treatment by the regular doctors who weren't acknowledging that women's health might need to be cared for specifically, or they might have issues instead of calling everything hysteria and asking women to take their uterus out, which was the regular medicine approach at the time. So he was important to that community. And when the Spanish flu came through that community, nobody in that specific small town, not a single person died of the Spanish flu, which was kind of unheard of at the time. And it was because he was going around giving everybody herbs to preemptively treat them for the flu. And what's also really wonderful about this person is that he never took payments from people he didn't think could afford it. So when he died, they found $38,000 in uncashed checks under his bed. Oops. Sorry, I'm bad about that. So that's the actual clinic. Oh yeah, and he was once again prosecuted for illegally practicing medicine that wasn't regular medicine. Um, the next thing I'm going to say is that in the 1960s and 70s is when Chinese medicine started to be standardized in this country. And the way it was standardized is interesting because over in China, during the communist regime, Mao decided to get a committee of people together and try and standardize Chinese medicine because it was very similar to how alternative medicine is practiced here. There's somebody over there doing this, and a little bit of that, and it's all a little different and kind of related. And this was this massive effort to make it all mesh. And in some ways, that's amazing because that's how we get to learn it here now, that this was then exportable to this country, and we get to learn a lot of basic tenets of this whole medicine. Other parts of it are a little awkward because it doesn't all mesh perfectly, and there are pieces that don't fit. And the more you delve into Chinese medicine, the more you get to find out things and try things and learn that there's probably 1,000 other branches that might have a little different ideas that could also be useful. Um, so this person, Ted Kapchuk, he was fleeing actually FBI surveillance for potentially having communist sentiments, and he met Daniel Bensky while they were in Macau. And they decided to legitimize themselves and became massive players in the TCM school curriculum. There's books by these people that we still use as textbooks today. And what's fascinating is the school they went to, they've never found proof of it existing or their credentials within it. I don't know if that matters or not because they clearly learned a lot of things. Um, and then in the 60s and 70s, also, there's this cohort of medical professors in the UCLA campus, and they were practicing Tai Chi, and they had one Chinese doctor with them that they were learning a lot of theory from and starting to be interested in acupuncture. And that group of professors ended up being really important too. Um, what happened next? Same time. I'm putting all these random things together because these happen at the same time, and that's part of what makes it hard to understand as a movement, that these things were playing against each other. So in 1970, the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, they took over Lincoln Hospital in New York, and they did it because there's the first round of an opioid pandemic happening, and they weren't getting the healthcare needs met by the medical system. Um, they took over. I felt like it lasted until the early '80s that they took over this hospital, and they started the Lincoln Hospital detox program there. Um, So that happens. And also in 1971, Nixon went to China and he had, this famous acupuncture treatment when his appendix ruptured, and he, like, came back, and there was this article in the papers, and everybody suddenly was really interested in Chinese medicine. 1 week later, that group of medical professors in UCLA, suddenly they were discovered by the media, and 3 days later, they formed the National Acupuncture Association, and that group of people then influenced a lot of the state's licensure and education policies that we still have today. Um, 1 month later, the UCLA research facility was starting to treat pain with acupuncture, and in 1972, a law passed making it illegal to practice acupuncture unless you were under the supervision of these medical physicians. Um, in 1976, the first TCM schools were started by that cohort, and in 1978, oh, that's when it was closed. The Lincoln Hospital was closed by police. Um, and in 1982, the three main regulatory bodies were created for regulating how schools are accredited and how we can practice acupuncture in this country. There's the guy who wrote the article about Nixon. And it's probably obvious why this is slightly problematic as, a whole field, but just to reiterate, it was done regulation of Chinese medicine was done by a small number of white people with very little experience in treating patients or knowing what acupuncture looks like in a community context. Um, and also, legitimizing and standardizing of Chinese medicine removed the heterogeneity of the field to what a small number of white people believed it to be and modeled it after a healthcare system that has been marginalizing other medicines and practitioners for over 150 years, reducing healthcare access drastically to most of the diverse population, which would be women, people of color, and poor communities. And next is another amazing superstar in community acupuncture. This is Miriam Lee. She was a factory worker who immigrated here in the late 60s, and she had studied Chinese medicine in Singapore. And she ended up treating people in a doctor's space when he wasn't there. And supposedly she had people going down the fire escapes, just waiting in line for her. And she ended up developing a protocol that is still used by a lot of community acupuncturists today. That's just 10 points. And she did the same treatment on every single person because she had this amazing, beautiful theory to pull it all together and why you could treat people universally and how that's not denying the individuality or uniqueness of every person's imbalance. She was also arrested. But so many people came to her court hearing that they kind of had to let her go, and then she was allowed to practice in the UCLA cohort with those research doctors, so it was just kind of interesting. And then next, this is Lincoln Hospital. They had some really beautiful demands for universal health care, and it definitely was a social justice movement at that point. Then they were very intentionally connecting community acupuncture to social justice. Um, they did a lot of educating and training people in this basic, what's called the NADA protocol now. It's a protocol that's used around the world, but it was used to help people suffering from addiction for the most part. There's some pictures of it. It's pretty cute. This is Dr. Tolbert Small, the people's doctor. He was the director of the Free Medical Clinic. He went to China and studied acupuncture with a group of Black Panthers. He didn't study with the schools in this country. None of the Black Panthers did, which I thought was interesting. They very consciously chose to go other places. Um, so he never got licensed in this country, and he practiced his entire life as an illegal acupuncturist and as a medical doctor. Dr. Matula Shakur, most people know who he is. He just died this last summer of bone marrow cancer. He was one of the people at the Lincoln Hospital treating people with acupuncture, and he formed the Black Acupuncture Advisory Association of North America, the Harlem Institute of Acupuncture, and he was training people and people in his community in acupuncture to empower people to just generate more healing amongst themselves. And that organization was shut down by a SWAT team as a terrorist organization. He spent most of his life in prison for his activities with the Black Panthers. And he was released December 2022. So he did have a few months to be with his family before he died. But he continued to do his work from prison. And yeah, he studied in Montreal. He also did not study in this country. This is Dr. Michael Smith. He also worked at Lincoln Hospital, and he's the one who started the NADA protocol as an official protocol. And it is basically 5 points in our ears, one of those microsystems that's used a lot around the world for any disaster situation or displaced people. It's embraced actually very well internationally. The only place it's not embraced well is here, and it's mostly because of regulations and laws around who can do what. This is a picture. That's the NADA protocol. It's just those regions of the ears. It's kind of basically supporting all the detox organs in your body and also calming your body so that you can make choices that are better for your own health. I should also mention POCA, People's Organization of Community Acupuncture, is kind of the voice of community acupuncture now. They started a clinic in 2002 in Portland, and in 2011, they started their own school, a community acupuncture school that also does a lot of training in like trauma-informed care and the history of social justice, this kind of thing, the history of Chinese immigration, just to get more people in the community practicing. And I think they got accredited as it's more similarly to a tattoo school. Somehow they went around a lot of this licensing stuff, and they still are around. They're still practicing today. There's a lot of acupuncturists coming out of that school, which I think is great. I've never been there though. But if you ever are looking for a community acupuncture clinic, you can always go on the POCA website and they list community acupuncturists around the country. This is just more about that school. It's also more affordable than a lot of the Chinese medicine schools if you're ever thinking about going into Chinese medicine. Um, it's one way you could. I think if you go to that school, you are required to become a community acupuncturist for at least a certain number of years. You can't go then become an individual acupuncturist because you're then treating less people, and the goal is to treat more people. Oh, and they're also responding to this little tidbit of truth that most people who graduate from acupuncture schools, I think it is about 70%, do not end up practicing. And that is because of all this regulation part. There's a lot of licensing costs, student loan debt, and lack of employment. So that's sort of that's the mission statement of POCA that I just copied onto there because I thought it was pretty nicely said. And that's all I've got. Thank you for listening. Does anybody have questions? It's only me currently working at Healing Roots doing the community acupuncture sessions. Emily will be doing community acupuncture with me on the 17th of February when we come. Yeah. Yeah.
What's the constant point at? And then there are differences between schools too, as far as length of time.
Okay, the question was, how much does it cost to go to acupuncture school, and what's the difference between the kinds of schools you might choose to go to?
You know, some are, 4 years versus different,
Yeah, some of them are different lengths of time. I think that generally they are 3 to 4 years, There's 2 schools in Minneapolis, and one's 3 years and one's 4 years, as far as I know. Um, and it really varies state by state, also what the licensing requirements are going to be. Um, and cost, Emily, it's a lot. I got federal loans to pay for school because I couldn't afford it. Um, but you can get federal loans for acupuncture school. It is accredited, so you can go as a graduate. It's a graduate program generally, and
Our school is $50,000.
50,000 for 4 years. Yeah, correct. You have to have an undergraduate degree to go to the program, but they didn't seem it seemed like generally you could have if you have a basic undergrad with the basic requirements, most people can go. I went to conceptual art school as an example of how well prepared I was to go into medicine. But I did take my basic requirements, you have to take basic science, math stuff. Is that all? Thank you. Thanks for listening.
I'd just like to say thank you to Emily and Amber. Um, and we're going to call it a night. We're going to schedule our community acupuncture sessions for anyone who's interested here. And then if you're watching online, look tomorrow for options for signing up if there's any open spots. Thanks. Thanks for coming, everyone.